There are jobs where being right is its own reward, where your accuracy rate, 94% in my case, means that somewhere out there, people who will never know your name get to go home to their families instead of coming home in boxes. And then there are jobs where being right makes you the enemy. I need you to understand something before we get to the disaster, before we get to the phone call at 3 in the morning and the congressional inquiry and the young man whose career ended because he thought experience was something you could download from a manual. I need you to understand what military intelligence actually is, not the Hollywood version with the dramatic briefings and the satellite feeds that resolve like magic, but the grinding, obsessive, deeply unglamorous reality of trying to predict violence before it happens. My name is Daniel. For 19 years, I served as an all-source intelligence analyst for the United States Army. My specialty was pattern of life analysis in denied environments, which is a technical way of saying that I watched people. Not through some dramatic cinematic lens where targets glow red on a screen, but through thousands of hours of drone footage, signal intercepts, human intelligence reports, financial records, and the kind of mundane detail that would put most people to sleep. I knew when a particular vehicle left a compound. I knew which cell phone numbers called which other numbers and for exactly how long. I knew that when a certain courier visited a certain market on a Thursday, there was an 87% probability that something significant would happen within 72 hours. I knew these things because I had spent nearly 2 decades learning to see. Not looking, seeing. The difference matters more than you can possibly imagine. When I tell you that I had a 94% accuracy rate on threat predictions, I don't say that to brag. I say it because that number represents hundreds of operations where commanders made decisions based on my assessments. Convoys that took alternate routes. Raids that happened at ZO 400 instead of 1400. Aircraft that diverted around weather systems that weren't actually weather systems. Each percentage point represented lives, ours and theirs, though we didn't talk much about theirs in the official briefings. I was good at my job. I was so good at my job that I had been offered promotion to warrant officer 3 separate times and turned it down 3 separate times because the additional rank would have pulled me out of analysis and into management. I didn't want to manage people. I wanted to understand patterns. I wanted to be the person who could look at a week's worth of seemingly disconnected data points and tell you that the quiet village 17 kilometers southwest of your forward operating base was about to become extremely not quiet. This story takes place in the spring of 2019 at a joint operations center somewhere in the Middle East. I'm not going to tell you exactly where, and I'm going to change enough details about the unit and the operation that you could spend a month in the archives without finding the official record. The security clearance I held, TSESCI with multiple compartmented accesses, meant that I spent my working hours in SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility, which is essentially a room built inside another room, shielded from electronic signals where the walls themselves are part of the security apparatus. You need to understand the SCF to understand this story. You don't just walk into SCIF, you badge in through multiple layers of authentication. You surrender your personal electronic devices at the door, phones, watches, anything with a chip. You work under rules so strict that we once had to evacuate the entire facility because someone accidentally brought in a Fitbit that they'd forgotten was in their pocket. The SCIF is where the actual work of intelligence happens, away from the PowerPoint briefings and the commander's update slides. It's where analysts sit in the half, light of multiple monitors, drinking terrible coffee, building the picture that commanders use to make decisions that kill people or save them. I had been at this particular Joint Operations Center for 14 months when our story begins. 14 months is a long rotation for an analyst. We usually move every 9 to 12 months to prevent burnout. because the work is mentally exhausting in ways that are difficult to describe. But I had volunteered to extend because we were in the middle of a complex operation tracking a network that had proven frustratingly resistant to our usual methods of disruption. I knew the data. I knew the personalities involved. I knew that we were close to a breakthrough, and I didn't want to hand that accumulated knowledge to someone fresh who would need 6 months just to understand what they were looking at. The operations center itself was typical for the theater. Modular buildings connected by covered walkways, surrounded by the constant low-grade chaos of any military installation. Helicopters overhead at all hours. The smell of burned pits that never quite went away, no matter what the environmental assessments claim. The particular rhythm of life that develops when thousands of people are living and working in a confined space under constant low-level threat. Our intelligence section occupied 3 rooms in the main operations building. The largest was the watch floor, where 12 analysts worked in rotating shifts, monitoring feeds and responding to requests for information from the operational units. The second was the briefing room, where we prepared materials for commanders. The third and smallest was where the senior analysts worked, myself and 2 others, each with our own areas of responsibility and our own networks of sources and methods that we had developed over years. I want to be careful here because I'm going to describe my colleagues in ways that might sound critical, and I don't mean to be. Intelligence work attracts a particular kind of personality, people who are comfortable with ambiguity, who can hold multiple contradictory possibilities in their minds simultaneously, who don't need immediate validation or public recognition. We were not, as a group, particularly impressive in uniform. We carried weight we shouldn't have from sitting 16 hours a day. We had the pale, slightly unhealthy look of people who rarely saw direct sunlight. We spoke in jargon so dense that even other military personnel often couldn't follow our conversations. But we were very, very good at what we did. The chief of our section was a civilian contractor named Margaret Chen, a former Army captain who had retired and come back as a GS-14 because the government couldn't find enough qualified analysts to fill the military billets. Margaret was the buffer between us and the operational commanders. She translated our assessments in the language that generals could understand, and she protected us from the constant pressure to produce certainty where certainty didn't exist. She was the reason I had extended my tour. Working for Margaret meant being able to do the job without the political theater that so often contaminated intelligence work. Our military commander was a colonel named Hartley, a special forces veteran who had done enough time in the field to respect what intelligence could provide and enough time in headquarters to understand its limitations. Hartley didn't pretend to understand the technical details of our collection methods, but he understood that good intelligence was the difference between success and catastrophe. He trusted Margaret. Margaret trusted us. The system worked. Until it didn't. The change began with a memorandum. In the military, significant changes always begin with memoranda. It's how the institution convinces itself that it's being deliberate and thoughtful, rather than simply reacting to the latest management fad. This particular memorandum came from Army Human Resources Command, and it announced a new initiative called Talent Management Optimization, which was HR speak for a series of cost-cutting measures disguised as efficiency improvements. The key provision for our purposes was the creation of something called Intelligence Operations Technicians, a new category of personnel that would replace senior enlisted analysts at a significantly lower cost. The theory, as explained in the accompanying briefing slides, was that modern intelligence software had become so sophisticated that the deep expertise of career analysts was no longer necessary. A junior service member with basic training and the right algorithms could produce equivalent results at a fraction of the price. I remember reading this memorandum in Margaret's office, watching her face as she processed the same information. She was 53 years old with 26 years of government service, and I watched her calculate exactly what this meant for the people she had spent her career developing. They're going to sustain this in 3 locations. She said, using the word pilot in the way that people do when they want to pretend that a decision hasn't already been made. Well, one of them, who's they sending? New second lieutenant, commissioned through the business school program at. She checked the memorandum. Duke, MBA with a concentration in operations management, no prior military service, no intelligence background. I set down the paper. Margaret, we can't. I know. Pattern analysis isn't. This isn't something you can automate. The software assists. It doesn't replace. We've had this conversation with the contractors every 6 months for the past 5 years. I know. Daniel, who approved this? She looked at me with the expression I would come to recognize as the moment before everything changed. Hartley fought it. He's being reassigned to Bragg in 30 days. New commander arrives next week. So in the DSIG ends, distant helicopter passes low overhead, the thumping rhythm slightly irregular. So I want to describe Lieutenant Benjamin Carrington carefully because I think it's important to understand that he wasn't a villain in the cartoon sense. He wasn't stupid, though I would argue he was ignorant in ways that proved more dangerous than stupidity. He wasn't malicious, though his actions would have consequences that I still think about. He was, in many ways, a product of a system that had convinced itself that management was a transferable skill, that leadership could be taught in classrooms, that the specific knowledge of specific jobs was less important than the general ability to optimize and leverage and synergize. Carrington was 26 years old. He had graduated from Duke's Fuqua School of Business with a concentration in operations management, then completed a 12-week officer commissioning program that was designed to produce technically proficient leaders for the modern battlefield. He had never deployed. He had never worked in intelligence. His entire exposure to military operations came from case studies and simulations and the kind of theoretical exercises that assume perfect information and rational actors. He arrived on a Tuesday, which I remember because Tuesdays were our heaviest analytical days. We spent Monday processing weekend collection, and Tuesday was when the patterns started to emerge. I was in the middle of tracking what I believed to be a significant shift in enemy logistics when Margaret called me to her office to meet our new section chief. Carrington was tall, maybe 6'2", with the kind of athletic build that suggested college sports and careful attention to diet. He wore his uniform with the slight stiffness of someone who had only recently learned to put it on correctly. His hair was cut to regulation, but I noticed that he touched it unconsciously as if still adjusting to the sensation. Lieutenant, this is Sergeant First Class Daniel Reeves, our senior all-source analyst. Daniel, Lieutenant Carrington, will be taking over section leadership effective immediately. I saluted. He returned it with a gesture that was technically correct, but somehow tentative, as if he was still verifying the proper sequence of movements. Sergeant Reeves, I've reviewed your personnel file. Impressive operational record. Thank you, sir. I want to schedule time with each of the senior analysts this week. My approach is to conduct a comprehensive assessment of current capabilities before implementing any changes. I believe in data-driven decision-making. Margaret's expression didn't change, but I knew her well enough to recognize the slight tightening around her eyes. Lieutenant, Daniel is in the middle of time-sensitive analysis. Perhaps we could. Tuesday afternoon, 1400, Carrington said, looking at his phone. I'll send a calendar invite. I use a particular framework for these conversations that I've found produces optimal outcomes. He smiled then, the confident smile of someone who had been consistently rewarded for being articulate and organized and good at presentations. I would come to know that smile very well in the weeks that followed. The interview, when it happened, was unlike any conversation I had ever had with a military supervisor. Carrington had transformed one of the briefing rooms into what he called his assessment space. The table cleared except for his laptop, a whiteboard with colored markers arranged by hue, and a printed agenda that he handed me as I entered. Daniel, I want to begin by establishing that I value your experience. 19 years is significant tenure. However, I also want to be transparent about my mandate. I've been tasked with achieving a 40% reduction in personnel costs while maintaining operational effectiveness. This is not optional. This is not negotiable. My success metrics are clear. I looked at the agenda. It was divided into sections: current state assessment, capability mapping, optimization opportunities, implementation timeline. Sir, with respect, I'm not sure how to respond to that. My job is to produce accurate intelligence assessments. I'm not sure how to translate that into. Exactly. He leaned forward, and I saw something I would come to recognize as the enthusiasm of someone who believes they've identified the essential insight. That's the problem. Your work product is excellent, but it's not scalable. It's not replicable. You have 19 years of pattern recognition stored in your head, and if you were hit by a bus tomorrow, that knowledge walks out the door with you. I train junior analysts constantly. We have standard operating procedures. We have documentation that runs to thousands of pages that no one reads. He pulled up a slide on his laptop. I had our IT section run an analysis. Did you know that your section generates approximately 2.3 terabytes of analytical product annually, but operational units only access 12% of it? The rest is digital hoarding, information collected because it might be relevant, stored indefinitely, creating server costs and search inefficiencies. I stared at him. Sir, the value of intelligence isn't always immediately apparent. Sometimes patterns only emerge when you can look across months or years of data. The fact that something hasn't been accessed doesn't mean it won't be critical next week. And that's exactly the mindset I'm here to change. He clicked to another slide. I've been reviewing commercial solutions. There are now AI platforms that can process imagery, signals, and human intelligence reports at speeds that dwarf human capability. Pattern recognition algorithms that don't get tired, don't have biases, don't require expensive benefits and retirement packages. With respect, sir, I've seen those platforms. They're assistive tools. They flag anomalies for human analysts to evaluate. They don't replace judgment. Not yet, but the trajectory is clear. He leaned back. Daniel, I'm going to be direct with you. My assessment is that your section is overstaffed by approximately 60%. You have 3 senior analysts doing work that could be handled by 1 analyst with appropriate technological support, plus a small number of junior personnel for quality control. The cost savings would be approximately 2.4 million annually, not including benefits and infrastructure. I felt something cold in my chest. Not fear, something more like the sensation of watching a vehicle slide on ice, knowing that no amount of steering would prevent what was coming. Sir, have you discussed this with Colonel Hartley? Colonel Hartley is no longer in command. I've been given full authority to restructure this section as I see fit, pending final approval from the Joint Task Force Commander. He paused. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that resistance is not productive. I'm not your enemy. I'm offering you an opportunity to be part of the solution. Your institutional knowledge is valuable during the transition period. After that, there may be consulting opportunities, contractor roles, ways to leverage your experience without the overhead of full-time employment. I stood up. My hands were shaking, and I put them behind my back. Military parade rest to hide it. Sir, I need to be clear about something. What you're describing would be catastrophic. The patterns I track, they're not linear. They're not algorithmic. They require understanding context that changes daily, cultural knowledge that can't be coded, the ability to recognize when something is missing. not just when something is present. And AI can tell you that a vehicle has appeared in a location where it wasn't before. It can't tell you that the vehicle's appearance represents a breakdown in a relationship between two tribal elders that you've been monitoring for 3 years, and that this breakdown means the safe corridor you've been using for resupply is about to become an ambush site. Carrington's expression didn't change. He made a note on his tablet. Emotional investment in legacy methods. Noted. Daniel, I appreciate your passion. I really do. But I've run the numbers. The probability that your intuition provides value above and beyond algorithmic analysis is not supported by the data. What you're describing as irreplaceable expertise is, in fact, a form of guild protection, creating artificial scarcity to inflate wages. It's understandable. It's human. But it's not optimal. I don't remember exactly what I said after that. I know that I maintained military bearing because 19 years of discipline doesn't disappear because a 26-year-old with an MBA has just explained that your career is a form of rent seeking. I know that I saluted and left and walked directly to the smoking area, though I didn't smoke, and stood there for 20 minutes breathing air that tasted of diesel and distant burning until my hands stopped shaking. Margaret found me there. Has already requested your transfer, she said. Effective end of month. They're creating a knowledge documentation role for you at the Joint Intelligence Center in Qatar. It's a retirement track. Daniel, they're putting you out to pasture. Can we fight this? Not through channels. He's got backing from the task force commander. Something about innovation initiatives and defense efficiency. The kind of language that plays well in congressional testimony. She lit a cigarette, though she had quit 5 years before. I'm being pushed out too. Early retirement incentive. They're replacing me with a contractor who specializes in agile management methodologies. We stood in silence. A convoy of MRAPs rumbled past on the main road, heading out for evening patrol. What about the operation? I asked. The network we've been tracking. We're close, Margaret. We're weeks away from mapping the entire command structure. Lieutenant Carrington has requested that all ongoing analysis be transferred to the new intelligence operations technicians. He's bringing in 3 of them next week. Recent college graduates, business analytics majors. He thinks they can learn what you know in a 2-week onboarding program. I laughed then, and the sound was ugly even to me. He's going to get people killed. Probably. She dropped the cigarette and ground it out. The question is whether you're going to be here to see it. I spent the next 2 weeks in a state that I can only describe as professional mourning. I knew with absolute certainty that everything I had built was being dismantled. I knew that the operation I had devoted 14 months to would collapse without the accumulated context that Carrington couldn't see and wouldn't value. But I also knew that I was powerless to stop it, and that any attempt to fight would only accelerate my removal and eliminate any possibility of influencing the transition. So I did what professionals do in these situations. I documented. I created detailed handover notes that I knew would never be read. I recorded video briefings explaining the nuances of sources and methods that couldn't be written down. I met with the junior analysts who would remain and tried to warn them in language that wouldn't be called insubordinate about what was coming. Carrington, for his part, was relentless in his optimism. He held daily stand-up meetings where the new intelligence operations technicians, 3 young men named Derek, Jason, and Colin, all recent graduates of state university business programs, would report on their learning velocity and competency acquisition. He installed new software platforms with interfaces designed for non-specialist users. He created dashboards and metrics and key performance indicators that measured activities rather than outcomes. I watched Derek, the senior of the 3 new technicians, attempt to analyze drone footage of a compound I had been monitoring for 8 months. The software flagged the vehicle as anomalous because it appeared at an unusual time. Derek marked it for operational follow-up. I knew, because I knew the family who lived in that compound, that the vehicle belonged to a cousin visiting from a neighboring province for a wedding. I knew that flagging it would result in surveillance resources being diverted from actual threats. I knew that explaining this would be interpreted as failure to adapt to new methodologies. I said nothing. This was the beginning of my malicious compliance, though I didn't have that language for it yet. I was following Carrington's explicit instructions to transition all analytical functions to the new team structure. If he believed that his technicians could do my job, then I would allow them to demonstrate that capability. The incident that should have been a warning came 11 days before my scheduled transfer. One of our forward operating bases requested urgent assessment of potential improvised explosive device activity along a resupply route. The request came in at 2300 during the night shift. Derek was on duty. I was in the SCF finishing my documentation, technically present, but officially transitioned from operational responsibilities. I watched him work. The software flagged 3 locations as elevated risk based on pattern analysis of previous ID placements. Derek prepared a briefing slide recommending route avoidance for all 3 locations. The slide was clean, professional, followed all the formatting guidelines that Carrington had instituted. What Derek didn't know, what he couldn't know, because Carrington's 2-week onboarding program didn't include historical analysis of failed IED attempts, was that 2 of those locations had been used repeatedly because they were obvious, because they were where unsophisticated attackers would place devices, and where experienced convoy commanders would expect them, and where the actual threat was minimal because the enemy knew we knew and had moved to more sophisticated methods months before. The 3rd location, which the software rated as low risk because it had no previous IED activity, was where I would have placed a device if I were trying to kill Americans. It was where a dry wadi crossed the road, offering natural concealment and an escape route into terrain that was difficult to follow. It was where a particular cell phone number, one I'd been tracking for weeks, had pinged a tower 3 hours before the request came in. I said nothing. I watched Derek send the briefing. I watched the convoy commander receive it and plan his route accordingly. I went home and I didn't sleep. And in the morning, I learned that the convoy had taken fire at the 3rd location. Not an IED, but an ambush that suggested the enemy had been waiting, which suggested they had known the road, which suggested that someone had been watching our analysis and learning from our patterns. No one was killed. 2 soldiers wounded, 1 seriously. The incident was classified as enemy contact, minor, and disappeared into the statistical background of daily operations. Carrington held a lessons learned session where Derek was praised for his rapid response and effective utilization of analytical tools. I sat in the back of the room and said nothing. When Carrington asked if I had any legacy perspective to contribute, I said that the new team appeared to be functioning well and that I was confident in the transition. This was the truth as Carrington had defined it. This was the world he had created. I was simply living in it. The final week of my assignment passed in a blur of administrative tasks and farewell conversations with colleagues who understood what was happening and were powerless to stop it. Margaret left 3 days before me, her departure so abrupt that we didn't have time for a proper goodbye. Just a hug in the parking lot and her whispered warning to document everything. Daniel, when this goes wrong, they're going to need someone to blame. On my last day, Carrington called me to his office for an exit interview. The term was corporate, borrowed from the business world he had come from, and it set the tone for everything that followed. Sergeant Reeves, I want to thank you for your professionalism during this transition. I know that change can be difficult for personnel with extensive tenure in legacy systems. You're welcome, sir. I've prepared a letter of recommendation for your personnel file. It emphasizes your cooperation with modernization initiatives and your willingness to embrace new methodologies. I believe it will serve you well in your next assignment. Thank you, sir. He leaned forward, and for a moment I saw something that might have been doubt or might have been my own projection. Daniel, off the record, I want you to understand that this isn't personal. The defense budget is finite. The threats we face are evolving. We need to be able to scale our capabilities, to deploy analytical support rapidly without requiring years of specialized training. What I'm building here, it's the future. It's necessary. I looked at him, this young man with his clean uniform and his optimized vocabulary and his absolute certainty that the world could be made to fit his frameworks. Sir, with respect, I've spent 19 years learning that the enemy gets a vote. They don't follow our optimization models. They don't respect our efficiency initiatives. They study us, they adapt, they find the gaps between what our systems predict and what actually happens. I stood up. I hope your model works. I really do. Because if it doesn't, the cost won't be measured in dollars or efficiency metrics. I saluted. He returned it. I walked out of the SCI for the last time, handed in my badge at the security desk, and collected my phone from the lockbox where it had spent the majority of my waking hours for the past 14 months. I had 72 hours of leave before my flight to Qatar. I spent them in the transient quarters, sleeping at odd hours, waking with the phantom sensation of pattern recognition, reaching for data that was no longer mine to access, seeing connections that I could no longer verify. On the second day, I received a text message from one of the junior analysts who had remained behind. It contained only a photograph, a screenshot of the operations center's internal messaging system showing a request for urgent all-source assessment that had been pending for 6 hours with no response. The request was from the same forward operating base that had been ambushed 2 weeks before. The subject line referenced anomalous activity patterns, multiple locations, possible coordinated operation. I stared at the image for a long time. Then I deleted it and the message and the contact. I was no longer assigned to that unit. I had no access to classified systems. Whatever was happening was no longer my responsibility. I told myself this repeatedly in the hours that followed. I told myself as I packed my bags for the flight to Qatar. I told myself as I sat in the departure terminal, watching military aircraft take off and land in the dusty afternoon light. The pattern was clear to me even without access to the data. I had seen the preliminary indicators weeks before, the shifts in communication patterns, the unusual movements of known actors, the subtle changes in logistics that suggested preparation for something significant. I had briefed Carrington on these indicators in one of our final meetings. He had noted them in his tablet under legacy analyst concerns to be validated against algorithmic assessment. The algorithms I knew would not validate them. The algorithms were looking for previous patterns, known signatures, established templates. What was coming didn't match anything in the database. It was new. It was adaptive. It was exactly the kind of threat that required the institutional knowledge Carrington had dismissed as guild protection. I boarded my flight to Qatar. I took my seat by the window and watched the base shrink beneath us until it was indistinguishable from the desert that surrounded it. I told myself that I had done everything required of me, that my obligations ended when my assignment ended, that the consequences of other people's decisions were not my responsibility. I almost believed it. Qatar was everything Afghanistan was not. Clean, climate controlled, organized to the point of sterility. The Joint Intelligence Center occupied a purpose-built facility on the edge of Aludad Air Base. All polished surfaces and efficient workflows, and the kind of corporate military environment that Lieutenant Carrington would have loved. My new role was exactly what Margaret had predicted, a knowledge management specialist, which meant I spent my days reviewing historical intelligence reports for lessons learned. that would be incorporated into training materials. The work was not meaningless exactly. It was simply disconnected from consequence. I was archiving knowledge that no one had asked for, creating documentation that would be filed and forgotten, contributing to the same digital hoarding that Carrington had criticized without understanding why it existed. I told myself I was adjusting. I told myself that 19 years of operational intensity had earned me this relative peace. I told myself that the patterns I saw in my dreams, the convoy roads and communication networks, and the faces of people I had watched for months without ever meeting, were fading, would fade, should fade. They didn't. On my sixth day in Qatar, I woke at 0400 with the absolute certainty that something had gone wrong. Not a specific knowledge. My access to classified systems had been downgraded with my transfer, and I had no official visibility into operations in my former theater. But the pattern was there in my mind, assembled from fragments of information I hadn't known I was processing: the ambushed convoy, the unanswered assessment request, the anomalous activity that the algorithms couldn't classify. I lay in my quarters, staring at the ceiling, and practiced the discipline that had kept me functional through 19 years of intelligence work. I separated what I knew from what I suspected. I knew that my former section was operating with degraded capability. I suspected that this degradation had created vulnerability. I knew that the enemy network I had been tracking was adaptive and patient. I suspected that they had identified the transition period as an opportunity. I did not know that I was right. I would not know for another 36 hours. The official notification came through unclassified channels, which was itself significant. If the incident had been contained, if it had been managed through normal operational reporting, I would have heard nothing. The fact that it appeared on open source military news sites, attributed to defense officials speaking on condition of anonymity, meant that the situation had exceeded the military's ability to control the narrative. Coordinated attack on forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan, multiple casualties, extensive damage to aircraft and infrastructure, investigation ongoing. I read the article 3 times, parsing the language for what it revealed and concealed. Coordinated, suggested multiple attack vectors, planned synchronization, command and control. Multiple casualties in military reporting usually meant deaths. The number withheld pending next of kin notification. Extensive damage to aircraft meant millions of dollars in losses, possibly billions, depending on what had been destroyed. I opened my personal laptop, violating at least 3 regulations, and accessed the messaging applications I had used to maintain informal contact with former colleagues. The junior analyst who had sent me the screenshot was offline. 2 others were marked away. Then a message appeared from someone I didn't recognize, a contractor who had been hired to replace Margaret, whose name I had forgotten as soon as I heard it. You need to call this number. Urgent. The number was a DSN line, Defense Switch Network, the military's internal telephone system. It was not a number that should have been shared through unclassified messaging. I stared at it for a long moment, understanding that I was being drawn back into something I had officially left, knowing that I had no obligation to respond, recognizing that I would respond anyway. I used the secure phone in the center's communications room, the one designated for personal calls that might involve sensitive information. The voice that answered was hoarse, exhausted, familiar in ways that took me a moment to place. Sergeant Reeves, this is Colonel Patterson. I took over from Hartley. I straightened automatically, military reflex. Sir, I wasn't aware. Your former section chief, Lieutenant Carrington, has been relieved of duty. I'm calling because I need to understand what the hell happened in that operations center, and everyone who might know is either dead, wounded, or too junior to have any context. The words landed like physical blows. Dead, wounded. The abstract casualties of the news article became specific, became people I had worked with, eaten with, argued with about sports teams and coffee quality and whether the pattern we were seeing was genuine or artifact. Sir, I don't have access to current intelligence. I've been in Qatar for 6 days. I don't know what happened. I know what happened. Patterson's voice was controlled fury, the kind that comes from having seen something that should have been prevented. What I don't know is why. And you're going to tell me. What Patterson told me, assembled from fragmentary reports and survivor interviews and the raw data that Carrington's systems had collected without understanding, was this: the enemy network I had been tracking had indeed identified the transition period as opportunity. They had watched the operations center's patterns change, different names on the assessment reports, different timing of responses, different indicators of what the center knew and didn't know. They had tested the new system with small probes, ambushes that revealed how quickly threats were identified, how accurately they were assessed, what responses they generated. Carrington's algorithms had performed exactly as designed. They had identified known patterns, flagged established signatures, generated confidence metrics for predicted outcomes. What they had not done, what they could not do, was recognize that the small probes were themselves a pattern, that the enemy was conducting the intelligence equivalent of penetration testing, mapping the new system's vulnerabilities. The attack that followed was sophisticated in ways that the algorithms had no category for. Multiple false flag operations designed to draw surveillance resources to irrelevant locations. Communication patterns that mimic known networks but serve different purposes. Logistics movements that appeared random unless you understood the tribal relationships that made them predictable. Derek, the senior intelligence operations technician, had processed the data through his dashboards and his metrics and his key performance indicators. He had generated assessments that were technically accurate. Elevated threat activity, multiple locations, recommend enhanced force protection, without understanding that the elevation was itself the deception, that the real attack would come where the threat appeared lowest because the enemy had studied what the algorithms weighted and what they ignored. The forward operating base that had requested urgent assessment 6 days earlier was the primary target. The assessment had never been completed. Derek had flagged it for additional algorithmic processing to resolve conflicting indicators. The conflicting indicators were the point. They were designed to create exactly the hesitation, the delay, the recursive analysis that left 13 American soldiers and 27 Afghan civilians dead. And Carrington, Lieutenant Benjamin Carrington, MBA, optimization specialist, architect of the future, had been in the operations center when the first explosions occurred. He had watched his systems fail in real time, had seen the dashboards show normal activity patterns. In sectors where mortars were falling, had heard the radio calls for support that his reduced staffing levels couldn't process fast enough. He had tried to lead. Patterson was clear about this, and I appreciated the fairness of the description. Carrington had not frozen, had not abandoned his post. He had attempted to coordinate the response using the management frameworks he had been taught, delegating tasks through the chain of command he had constructed, trusting the processes he had implemented to handle the crisis they had been designed for. The processes had not been designed for this. They had been designed for efficiency, for scalability, for cost reduction. They had not been designed for an enemy who understood that the best time to attack is when your opponent believes their systems are working perfectly. I arrived back at the Joint Operations Center 40 hours after Patterson's call. Not officially. My transfer to Qatar had not been reversed. My access to classified systems remained suspended. I arrived as a consultant, a contractor, a subject matter expert, retained through emergency hiring authority to assist with the after-action investigation. The physical space was unchanged. The same modular buildings, the same covered walkways, the same smell of diesel and distant burning. But the atmosphere was different in ways that went beyond the normal tension that follows catastrophic loss. There was shame here, the particular shame of an organization that has been publicly exposed, that knows its failures will be analyzed and criticized and politicized, that must continue functioning while being dissected. Carrington was gone, relieved of duty, escorted from the base, facing administrative separation and possible criminal charges depending on the investigation's findings. I never saw him again. I would learn later, through the informal networks that persist in any military community, that he had returned to civilian life, taken a position with a logistics company, married, had children. I don't know if he ever understood what happened. I don't know if he still believes that his approach was correct in theory, failed only in implementation, that the next time, given better data, better algorithms, better trained technicians, the outcome would be different. I hope not. I hope he understood. But I don't know. The three intelligence operations technicians had also been removed. Derek, I was told, had been particularly affected, had required medical evacuation for psychological crisis, had been found in the operations center hours after the attack, still attempting to process data through systems that no longer functioned, unable to accept that his tools had failed him. I felt something for Derek that I didn't feel for Carrington. Derek had been given responsibility without foundation, asked to perform a job that required years of development in weeks of training. His failure was predictable. His punishment seemed excessive. The operations center itself was being restructured. Patterson had been given temporary authority to restore previous staffing levels, to rehire experienced analysts, to rebuild the institutional knowledge that had been discarded. I was asked to assist, to document what had been lost, to help train replacements who could eventually replace me again. I agreed because I couldn't imagine refusing. I agreed because 13 Americans and 27 Afghans were dead, and someone had to be responsible, and I had been responsible before and knew what it cost. I agreed because the patterns were still there, the network still active, and if I didn't try to rebuild what had been destroyed, the next attack will find an even more vulnerable target. The reconstruction took 8 months. 8 months of reviewing data that Carrington's systems had collected and misinterpreted, of identifying the specific points where human judgment would have changed outcomes, of training new analysts in methods that I had learned from mentors who were now retired or dead. I testified before 3 investigations, the Army's internal review, the Joint Task Force assessment, and a closed session of the House Armed Services Committee. I told the truth as I understood it, which was that the disaster resulted from a fundamental misunderstanding of what intelligence work requires. Not processing power, not algorithmic efficiency, not cost optimization. Judgment developed through experience tested against reality, corrected by failure, refined by success. The committee members asked predictable questions. Could AI assist intelligence analysis? Yes, I said, it already did. Could it replace human analysts? Not for the foreseeable future. And attempts to force that replacement would continue to produce catastrophic outcomes. Was the military doing enough to develop and retain experienced personnel? No, I said, and the incentives remain misaligned, rewarding short-term cost reduction over long-term capability, management credentials over operational knowledge. One member, a representative from a district with significant defense employment, asked whether I was simply protecting my own job category. I told him that I would welcome genuine automation of intelligence analysis, that 19 years of 16-hour days in windowless rooms had not been my preferred career path. But I would not pretend that wishful thinking could substitute for demonstrated capability. The enemy, I said, does not cooperate with our efficiency initiatives. They study our systems and find the gaps. The only effective response is human judgment, continuously developed, adequately resourced, and protected from the political pressure to demonstrate cost, savings that sacrifice function. I don't know if he believed me. I don't know if any of them did. The military's response to the disaster was predictable: new regulations, additional oversight, revised training requirements. The underlying pressure to reduce costs, to replace expensive expertise with cheaper alternatives, to manage what cannot be managed through spreadsheet optimization, these pressures remained. They always remain. They are the permanent temptation of large organizations, the belief that complexity can be simplified, that experience can be systematized, that the particular knowledge of particular people is an inefficiency to be eliminated rather than a capability to be preserved. At 222, I retired from military service in 2021, 2 years after the attack. Not because I was forced out. Patterson had offered me a warrant officer commission, a permanent position, the institutional authority to protect what I had rebuilt. I declined for the same reason I had declined 3 times before. I didn't want to manage. I wanted to understand patterns. And I had come to understand that the pattern of military intelligence, the fundamental tension between operational necessity and bureaucratic pressure, was not something I could change from within. I work now as a contractor, which is the traditional path for retired intelligence personnel. I consult with companies developing assistive technologies for analysis, helping them understand what their tools can and cannot do. I teach occasional seminars at the intelligence school, trying to convey to new analysts what took me years to learn: that the data is never complete, that certainty is always provisional, that the most important skill is recognizing what you don't know. I think about Lieutenant Carrington sometimes, not with the anger I felt in the immediate aftermath, the cold fury of watching someone destroy what I had built through ignorance and confidence, with something more complicated. He was, in his way, a victim of the same system that produced the disaster, a system that rewards the appearance of efficiency over demonstrated effectiveness, that values credentials over capability, that believes management is a transferable skill independent of the work being managed. I could have been more helpful to him. In the early days of his assignment, when I still believed I could prevent what was coming, I could have found language that he would have understood. I could have translated my concerns into his vocabulary of metrics and optimization, shown him how experience actually improves outcomes rather than simply increasing costs. I tried, I think, but I was also angry and tired and convinced that the obvious failure of his approach would be apparent without my intervention. I was wrong about that. The failure was not obvious until people died. And by then, the opportunity for correction had passed. The final phone call came in 2022, more than 3 years after the attack. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered because it was a DSN line and those still triggered automatic response. Daniel, it's Ben. Ben Carrington. I was silent for a moment, processing. The voice was older, heavier, carrying weight that hadn't been there before. Lieutenant Carrington, I, I'm surprised to hear from you. I know, I wasn't sure I should call. A pause, the sound of breathing. I've been following your testimony, the committee hearings, the articles, the book you're writing. I wanted to tell you. You were right. What you tried to tell me. I didn't understand then. I do now. I didn't know what to say. I had imagined this conversation, or versions of it, during the long months of Reconstruction. In my imagination, I was eloquent, forgiving, wise. In reality, I was tired, and the anger I thought I had processed returned with unexpected force. 13 Americans, Ben. 27 Afghans. You understand that now. I understand that I made decisions based on incomplete information, that I didn't recognize the limits of my knowledge, his voice broke slightly, that I was more concerned with demonstrating my capabilities than with understanding what was actually needed. Why are you calling me? Because I'm trying to do something with it. I've been working with veterans organizations trying to improve how we prepare officers for actual command. And I keep running into the same problem. The system rewards what I did, the MBA programs, the management training the optimization frameworks. They're not wrong in themselves, but they're being applied in contexts where they don't fit by people who don't know what they don't know. I listened to him describe his current work, the advocacy, the attempts to reform military education. It was sincere, I thought, possibly useful. But it didn't change what had happened, what he had done, what I had allowed by my silence in the final weeks. Ben, I appreciate you calling, I do. But I can't. I searched for words that wouldn't be cruel. That would be true. I can't tell you that I forgive you. I don't know if forgiveness is the right category. You made choices. People died. I'm still living with that, and I suspect you are too. I am. Every day. Then maybe that's enough. Maybe that's what we have. Not resolution. Just continued responsibility. We ended the conversation there. He didn't call again, and I didn't try to reach him. I don't know if his current work will prevent future disasters. I don't know if the military will learn from what happened, or if the pressure to reduce costs will eventually produce another Carrington, another optimization initiative, another catastrophe that seems obvious in retrospect and invisible to those living through it. What I know is this intelligence work is human work. It requires judgment developed through experience, tested against reality, continuously corrected. It cannot be automated, cannot be optimized, cannot be reduced to cost per analysis metrics without losing the essential capability that makes it valuable. The enemy understands this. They study our systems, identify our vulnerabilities, exploit our confidence in technology that promises efficiency at the expense of understanding. We can choose to learn this, to invest in the people and the time and the institutional patience that genuine expertise requires. Or we can continue the cycle of disruption and disaster, replacing experience with credentials, judgment with algorithms, until the next attack exposes the gaps we have created. I have made my choice. I continue to work, to teach, to argue for the value of what I spent 19 years learning. Whether anyone listens, whether the patterns I see in data and in organizations will be recognized before the next catastrophe, that is not in my control. It never was. The only choice is to continue to bear witness, to hope that experience eventually prevails over the eternal temptation to believe that complex problems have simple solutions. The SCF is still there, in whatever form it takes now. New analysts sit in the half, light of multiple monitors, drinking terrible coffee, building pictures that commanders use to make decisions. Some of them will develop the judgment that this work requires. Some will leave frustrated by the grind, the ambiguity, the constant pressure to produce certainty where certainty doesn't exist. A few will become the senior analysts of the future, the ones who see what others miss, who warn of dangers that algorithms cannot detect. I hope they are listened to. I hope their experience is valued. I hope that when the next young officer arrives with fresh credentials and absolute confidence, someone in the chain of command has the authority and the will to protect what actually works from what merely sounds efficient. This is the pattern I have learned to see. This is the story I needed to tell. Whether it changes anything, whether anyone hears it before the next disaster, that is the question that keeps me awake, that will keep me awake until I finally stop trying to predict what cannot be predicted and simply accept that the work continues, with or without me, as it always has and always will.